Presidents Xi and Putin and 27 other world leaders met in Moscow for the Victory Day celebrations. Subsequently, Russia and China have issued a joint statement on global strategic stability. We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we will be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country we are told to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, KJ No. These are this week's headlines. The U.S. backs down, suspends tariffs on China for 90 days. After 2 days of negotiation with Chinese negotiators in Geneva, Switzerland, the U.S. has agreed to suspend tariffs on China for 90 days. In response, the Chinese have also agreed to lift their reciprocal tariffs. This brings U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods down to 30% from the 145% previously imposed, and it also brings down Chinese tariffs on U.S. goods down to 10%. China's total export volume increased last month by 8.1%, despite dropping by 1/5 to U.S. markets, demonstrating China's resilience in diversifying its exports. China's GDP had seen a surge above 5% in the previous month. This contradicts the Trump administration's expectations that the de facto embargo would bring China's economy rapidly to its knees. On the other hand, U.S. stock markets, treasury markets, job markets, and dollar valuation saw abrupt and shocking declines, while supply chain breakdowns and empty shelves spooked the economy. The U.S. GDP contracted in the first quarter, hitting minus 0.6% growth and stoking fears of an imminent recession. President Trump had said previously trade wars are easy to win. However, he began offering unilateral concessions to China even before negotiations had begun. The Chinese government has steadfastly insisted that trade should be a win-win proposition, and Chinese netizens have pointed out that the U.S.'s so-called trade issues are really issues of maldistribution and bad internal policy. Pakistan's Chinese jets shoot down French jets in Pakistan-India conflict. As Pakistan and India's simmering tensions roiled and exploded into kinetic combat, Pakistan's Chinese J-10C shots shot down India's advanced Rafale jets in aerial combat. In one of the largest dogfights since World War II, 125 planes engaged in long-distance aerial combat. Pakistan claimed to have shut down 5 Indian planes, including 3 French Rafale jets, at least one of which was downed with a PL-15 missile launched from a Chinese J-10C jet. The top-of-the-line Indian Rafale jet, equipped with Meteor missiles and costing over $280 billion, was supposed to give India definitive air superiority. It had never been shot down before. On the other hand, the Chinese J-10 jet is a 27-year-old airframe that has never been tested in combat. Military experts have characterized this outcome as another DeepSeek moment, referring to the breakout AI that demonstrated China's capacity for technological prowess developed at a fractional cost of the West. This also complicates U.S. designs for war against China. U.S. war planners had previously derided Chinese weapons platforms as untested in war, and China has not been at war since 1979, and therefore unlikely to be effective. This development scrambles all of those assumptions. Chinese scientists predict Alzheimer's and other diseases 15 years out using AI methods. Chinese scientists are using AI to superpower early disease detection. Among these methods reported in Nature last year, a team from Fudan University developed an AI program to predict Alzheimer's 15 years ahead of its occurrence using blood testing. The AI algorithm screens 1,500 plasma proteins, identifying key disease markers, which then gives scientists the capacity to detect the early onset of Alzheimer's up to 15 years before noticeable clinical or cognitive decline appears. The Fudan researchers have also created the world's first atlas of plasma proteins in healthy and diseased states, and are currently working on developing a low-cost detection kit which will help predict diabetes and heart disease risks. Chinese tech giant slashes AI training costs by nearly 90%. Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba has demonstrated it is possible to slash AI training costs by 88% using zero search, a method which improves search capabilities using simulation without interactions with actual search engines. This method reduces the high costs of search by using a reference model to train other AI systems rather than routing queries directly to a search engine. This follows a train of Chinese innovations in AI algorithms, most notably DeepSeek's AI groundbreaking innovations in increasing compute efficiency. Ruling DPP erases Chinese as an ethnic identity on Taiwan Island. The incumbent DPP authorities on Taiwan Island have reclassified the Chinese Han majority ethnic group as other in their listing of demographic groups on the government's official information page. The official page listed Taiwan Island as having a registered population of 2.6% indigenous, 1.2% foreign, and 96.2% other population. Previously, the other category had been labeled as Han Chinese and stated that the current registered population is composed of Han Chinese as the largest ethnic group, accounting for 96.4% of the total population. This erasure is seen as yet another effort to try to expunge the province's Chinese identity as the U.S. quizzling authorities seek to distance the region from the mainland as the U.S. Ukrainizes the island for war against China. Still, Taiwan Island's official language is Chinese. It celebrates Chinese holidays. It eats Chinese food, follows Chinese customs, and its official title is the Republic of China. The National Museum, its repository of tangible history and culture, contains 700,000 artifacts from China. Important developments in Russia-China relations have been announced since President Xi and Vladimir Putin's meeting in Moscow during President Xi's visit for the Victory Day celebrations. China and Russia released a joint statement on global strategic stability, which included explicit condemnation of the US's nuclear counterforce posture and a reassertion of Russia and China's role in World War II. To help us unpack the political implications of this and other developments, I'm joined today by historian Peter Kuznik in Washington and filmmaker Regis Tremblay in Moscow. Welcome.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining. I want to jump right in, but before we discuss the Victory Day celebrations, I'd like to actually touch on some breaking news. The U.S. has removed its 145% tariffs on China. It suspended them for 90 days. And currently, we're looking at 30% tariffs for China and 10% reciprocal tariffs from China against the United States. I just wanted to ask you, Peter, what do you think this abrupt climb down by the Trump administration signals China demanded removal of all tariffs before they could enter into negotiations, which is what the U.S. seems to have done. They've seemed to have removed all the tariffs that were imposed on Liberation Day. That says this is just a reprieve. It's not a deal yet. But the markets seem to be taking it as a positive message. How do you see it, Peter?
I see that Trump was under tremendous pressure from American industrialists, American importers, American exporters, the American public. This was absurdity, lunacy on Trump's part. Xi Jinping likes to talk about win-win diplomacy. Trump talks about zero-sum game diplomacy. We win, you lose. This was even worse. This is lose-lose diplomacy. It made no sense what he was doing. He was hurting his own base. He was effectively threatening the world economy with global collapse. And everybody was telling him that this idea was not only self-destructive, it was globally destructive. And so it made no sense. He was looking for an excuse to walk this back, and so that he could claim some kind of victory. It was like that comment that Malcolm X once made about somebody sticking a knife into his back and then pulling it out 2 inches and saying that this is progress somehow. It didn't make any sense from an economic standpoint, from a political standpoint, from a moral standpoint. It was the absurdity of Trump's limited understanding of economics and his idea that running a trade surplus with the United States means you're exploiting the United States. You're unfairly treating the United States. This has been a benefit for the United States, and the global trade system that the U.S. set up after World War II has allowed the U.S. to maintain its position of hegemony. This is not something that was foisted upon the United States by unfair nations taking advantage. I go back to that great statement that George Kennan made in 1948 when he said that we have 6.3% of the world's population, but we control 50% of the world's wealth. He said we cannot help but be the object of envy and resentment. The challenge ahead of us in this period is to maintain this position of disparity. And we're not going to do so through idealistic slogans. We're not going to do so by talking about democracy and freedom. We're going to do so by dealing in cold power concepts. And that's what the United States did, and established this global system that benefited the United States. But in Trump's truncated worldview, this somehow was the United States giving away to other countries, the countries taking advantage of the United States. It just was lunacy. And so, yeah, they walked it back a little bit. They walked it back. 30% tariffs are still huge tariffs. And who's going to pay them? Not the foreign countries that are exporting to the United States, but the American consumers. So we're going to see, I assume, further walkbacks from that. And China held most of the cards. China was in a stronger position. China was not in a position where they needed to capitulate to U.S. pressure. And the United States was in a position where it had to walk this back. And so Trump did so partially, but it's not resolved and it's not ended.
Yes, and I think it's important to point out that in the last month, since the declaration of tariffs, China's exports to the rest of the world have actually increased by 8.1%, at the same time that, of course, they've diminished towards the United States. But China clearly seems to have planned well and is showing strength as far as its exports and its GDP are concerned. At the same time that the United States right now, in the most recent quarter, has shown negative GDP growth. And so I think you're absolutely right, Peter. I think it was a confluence of pressures and hopefully the better angels of Trump's administration, who have been perhaps hopefully talking some sense into him. Do you feel that we are on a good track as far as these tariffs are concerned, or do you think that it's still unpredictable?
I think we're still on a bad track where these are concerned. Some of his advisors, like Bessent, understand that. But he's got other advisors on trade and foreign policy who don't seem to understand that. And it's part of the broader context that you and I talked about, that there are people there, the China hawks especially, who want to do anything they can to provoke a confrontation with China, certainly to do it economically, but as we talk about, I'm sure, also to do so militarily. So there are some people in there who want a trade war with China, and there are some who want to go beyond a trade war with China.
I absolutely agree with you, and we can discuss this much more. But right now, I want to pivot to Regis. Regis, thank you for joining us. You're in Moscow right now, and I take it that you have been attending the Victory Day parades. What is the mood in Moscow right now, and what impression did you get? I know that there are 27 world leaders currently in Moscow to celebrate Victory Day with Russia. What does all of this tell us about the current geopolitical situation?
Well, first of all, I think the feeling that I've gotten from being here is that there's a tremendous expression of patriotism, a tremendous expression of a love for the motherland and for the defense of the motherland. As Peter very well knows, I think it's part of the Russian DNA that they have had to defend themselves for centuries from the West. And the people seem to be resolute. They seem to be confident in the victory that is theirs. That's the feeling that I got. There's so many thousands of people that were in the streets. Security was unbelievable, but the Russian people were there to express what I just said, their patriotism, their belief in the motherland, and their support for President Putin. The people here, for the most part, trust him. The fact that some 28 or 29 foreign prime ministers and presidents and dignitaries were here was a very big deal, a major statement to the United States and the, quote, West, that Russia is not isolated, that Russia, together with China, together with North Korea, together with Cuba, together with Africa, together with Asia, are not isolated, but are united. And I think this is the strong message that President Putin made in his public statements, is that we are united, we are committed to the principles of the United Nations Charter, and we are committed to the strict observance of international law. I think this is the feeling here. It's a very hopeful feeling, in spite of the fact that we have this conflict in Ukraine and all of the noise that's coming from the United States and the West about whether there's going to be peace talks this week on Thursday between Zelensky and Putin. And Zelensky's the one who have passed it into law in Ukraine that he cannot speak to the Russian leader. We'll see if that's going to happen. But it seems like most of the rest of the world is supportive of Russia and China and their desire for a lasting peace here in this part of the world.
Thank you, Regis. I'm also noting that President Fico of Slovakia and President Vučić of Serbia attended. despite, in particular, President Vucic, despite being blackmailed, threatened, and even obstructed from traveling over EU airspace. Why do you think there is such anger at any commemoration of the USSR's accomplishments?
I think there's a real disparity between Brussels and the European Union and the people of the countries of Western and Eastern Europe. It's been described as, by the Russians, by Peskov, even by President Putin and Dmitry Medvedev, there's a rebirth of neo-Nazism across the European Union, not so much among the people, but among the leaders who are unelected. And I think that in terms of Russia, when they look at that, they keep saying, that these people are trying to rewrite history. These people are trying to continue to demonize Russia. And the more than 2,500 sanctions which the United States and the West have imposed on Russia has had very little effect. Russia has protected itself from these sanctions and any future sanctions. So I think it was an incredible statement. It was all over the news here, where Vucic and Fischel made joint statements condemning this continuation of fascism and neo-Nazism, and for the failure of Eastern and European countries for honoring the tremendous sacrifice that the Soviet and Russian people paid to liberate them from fascism in Nazi Germany.
I think there's also starting to be an acknowledgement that China was also very instrumental in the fight against fascism. But Peter, I also want to get your opinion. Why do you think there is such a revisionist history going on right now? What are your thoughts about this rewriting of World War II history?
I think there's a fight for history going on all over the world right now. All the governments are trying to instrumentalize it, sanitize it, whitewash it, and deploy it. This is not anything new, but it's been more deliberately and consciously done than in the past. Oliver Stone and I have gone to many places and talked about this. That's really why we wrote Untold History of the United States, in order to counter the myths about U.S. history. And we go to Japan and we issue a statement and give talks titled U.S. and Japan Partners in Historical Falsification. Abe was perhaps the most notorious, but this is part of the Japanese leader's DNA as well. And there's nothing more important in terms of the 20th century than the victory over fascism and Japanese imperialism in World War II. And so it makes sense that we're fighting over that. And it's sad to me. Regis and I have talked about this at length, about the myths coming out of the fundamental myths about World War II. But one of the biggest ones is that the Americans and the Europeans were taught that the U.S. won the war in Europe, that the U.S. was responsible for defeating Nazi Germany. And if we look at the polling on this, some of the statistics I've seen in the previous polls show that somewhere between 13 and 17% of the European public credits the Soviets with playing a major role in defeating Germany, not necessarily the major role. In France, in 1945, 57% of the French people said that the Soviets played the leading role in defeating Germany. Now I've seen statistics saying that 7% of the French believe that. The reality is that throughout most of World War II, the U.S. and Britain faced 10 German divisions between us, while the Soviets were facing more than 200 by themselves. There's a reason why Churchill even said that the Red Army tore the guts out of the German war machine, why the New York Times had articles in 1942, as early as 42, saying that if we don't end up the war with a fascist victory, it's because of the heroic contribution of the Russian people, the Soviet people. We knew that once, and now we're fighting over that and trying to obfuscate it. And to give you an example, I did an anonymous survey with my students, and these are all A students in high school. And I asked them how many Americans died in World War II. And the median answer I got was 90,000. Okay, they're only 300,000 off. That's in the ballpark. I asked them how many Soviets died in World War II. The median answer I got was 100,000, which means they're only 27 million off. It means they know nothing about World War II, the Cold War, what's going on now in Ukraine. Without understanding history, you can't make sense out of what's happening. Joe and Lai once commented that the charming thing about Americans is that they have absolutely no historical memory. Well, it's not so charming. The philosopher Santayana said, "A country without memory is a country of madmen." And I think he's closer. It's not very charming, but this is the situation we're confronting. And so the fact that Putin and Xi Jinping stress so much between them in their statements, how this was a united fight against fascism, especially it's really very, very important now because as we see it's happening in the world, fascism is resurgent. Fascism is making a comeback. The fascists are gaining a toehold in many places that they didn't have one for a long time. And so we got fascism, we got militarism, we got the threat of nuclear war again in a way that we haven't seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world is at a very, very dangerous moment, and we've got to understand our history if we're going to be able to figure out how we walk back off the ledge, which is what the leaders should all be doing. And I'm glad to see Putin and Xi Jinping at least talking about that, and maybe some positive developments in Istanbul, between India and Pakistan. Not so much between the U.S. and China, but even a little one, at least in terms of talking and a temporary minimal agreement on trade. So there's some positive things going on in the world right now, and even talking to the Iranians. So, I mean, there are people who are pushing for military confrontations everywhere, and then there are other people who are trying to walk us back off of that.
Yes, absolutely. Talking about history and historians, the Chinese historian Sima Qian, records of the historian, he believed that the duty or the moral duty of the historian was actually greater than that of the emperor, because his job was to correct the record for the good of all, to rectify history and human memory, and in so doing, ensure the continuity of human morality. That is, literally to put humanity back on track. And I find it extremely disturbing that there is such distortion of history going on. And also, as you point out, this reversion to fascism, I don't think it's a profound thing to say that capitalism in crisis reverts to fascism. But I also wanted to ask you about the joint statement by the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China on global strategic stability. This was issued on May 8th, and it was in the context of the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Second World War. And both President Xi and President Putin are emphasizing the importance of maintaining and strengthening global strategic stability, at the same time that they're pointing out the serious challenges facing the international community right now. What are your thoughts about this statement, and how do you assess their assessment?
When I look at what's gone on in the world over the past year, it's really quite sobering. And the I go back, for example, let me start with the ATACMS. When Biden gave authorization for Ukraine to use the ATACM missiles that the U.S. provided to strike deep inside of Russia, the CIA issued a report saying that they thought there was a 50-50 chance this would lead to a nuclear war. I mean, that's madness. And how do the Russians respond? They use their Oreshnik missile to take out Ukrainian military facilities. The Oreshnik is a very powerful nuclear-capable missile. Former U.S. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster said the United States won't have any missile defense system that can counter the Oreshnik for at least another 15 years. And on top of that, then Putin changed Russia's nuclear doctrine to say that if if a non-nuclear nation attacks inside of Russia and is supported by a nuclear nation like the United States or France or Britain, then both of them are legitimate targets for any kind of response that Russia would wage. So we were getting very, very close. I go back to last August 20th. There was an article by David Sanger in the New York Times in which he said the United States is preparing to fight a three-front nuclear war simultaneously against Russia, China, and North Korea. But that same day, there was an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that said that there are top advisors who believe that we can fight and win a nuclear war. And we've seen that more recently. Again, top military leaders talking about that. You put that together with some of the very belligerent statements that are being made by American military leaders in the Pacific. We had Admiral Davidson talking about the likelihood of war by 2027. We have General Minihan, who said that he thought that we're going to be at war, the U.S. would be at war with China by 2025. And then we've had more recent statements along those lines. So there are people who think that we can solve things militarily, and if it ends up in a nuclear war, it can be limited, or the United States can win because other countries are going to back down. I was on today on an Indian TV show, and in the midst of it, I've been doing a lot of Indian TV because of the crisis between India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed nations, in which, when I go on these shows, the hatred between the Indians and Pakistanis is so palpable, the nationalism is so strong that their judgment is clouded. And so today, while we were on, Modi had just issued a statement saying that India will not be intimidated by any of Pakistan's nuclear threats any longer, that India will not be limited by nuclear blackmail on the part of Pakistan. And I'm on with all these Indian military leaders and political leaders. And to a man, they're all cheering that on, saying it's great that we're not going to be intimidated. Well, you follow this cycle of escalation that's going on. And now they were striking each other's military bases deep inside of both countries. They were on this escalatory ladder that we didn't know where it was going to end. And so if India is stronger in terms of conventional forces than Pakistan, but Pakistan has about an equal number of nuclear weapons. And Pakistan's response is going to be, is their doctrine is to use nuclear weapons. And so they might think they're lobbing one limited nuclear weapon, a tactical weapon at India, and then India is going to respond with maybe two. And then, for decades, the Pentagon has been trying to do war games about a limited nuclear war, and they're never able to limit it. It always ends up in full-scale nuclear war. And we know that even a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, would create partial nuclear winter and lead up to 2 billion deaths, and go into it a lot more detail. But that's what we're in, a world in which we've got leaders who are not responsible statesmen and need to be replaced, and need to be constrained, because left to their own devices, anything is possible.
Peter, I think that this statement from the joint statement by the Russian Federation People's Republic of China addresses those issues directly. And it's quite striking for me because it's the first time that I have actually seen this stated, explicitly. But they are critiquing, the U.S. placement of intermediate range and short range missile. And in particular, they're critiquing the acquisition of counterforce systems, that is, counter-value, counterforce systems for deep precision strikes, kill chains, counter-strike capacities. So they're saying, essentially, they're saying to the West that we are aware that you are planning or considering the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And we are trying to send a message to you that this is not acceptable, and that all efforts have to be taken to prevent this, very, very tangible escalation. But I think, as you point out, I think there is a large number of elites in the national security top echelon who seem to think that not only is nuclear war doable, but that it's also winnable, and that they are constantly not merely dog whistling as they were before, but actually urging and preparing the use of tactical nuclear weapons in war, in preparation for war with China. And that seems to just almost have been normalized.
And KJ, the way I look at it now, it's even more dangerous than that right now. You look, 73% of the South Koreans, according to the polls, say they want South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons. There are people in Taiwan talking about getting nuclear weapons. Ishiba, before he became Japanese prime minister, not only talked about an Asian NATO, but he talked about Japan, the most anti-nuclear country that was victimized by U.S. atomic bombs, getting its own nuclear weapons. We've got the discussion in Europe where Starmer and Macron are talking about extending a nuclear umbrella to Germany, and Merz says he likes the idea, to Poland. And Zelensky has said he thinks that Ukraine should have its own nuclear weapons. We have the situation with Iran, in which Netanyahu was urging the U.S. to join Israel in bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. Had they done so, they likely could not have destroyed them. The program would have set it back a little, but Iran would have raced for its own nuclear weapons. And if Iran developed nuclear weapons, how far behind would Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Turkey be? We're on the verge of nuclear anarchy. And, and even if the goal is not to initiate a nuclear war, the likelihood of a spark lighting that fire in a nuclear armed world like that, the danger is enormous already, but it could be magnified tenfold unless we have some real leadership. And I think Putin and Xi understand that. I think they understand. Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, we call it defense in quotes, it's not defense, used to be called the Secretary of War till 1947, and that's what he is. And proud of it. Hegseth said we have to end the war in Ukraine so the United States can go after the real enemy, China. And we know that there are others in this administration who share that view. And so it's not enough to end one war in order to start another one. What we need is an entirely different mindset, which is why the absolute absence of strategic stability talks under the Biden administration was so frighteningly dangerous. And now maybe we're in a position when it's strange to say that Donald Trump could in any way possibly be a force for greater sanity, but maybe he seems to on some level understand. I mean, I think he wants to impose fascism, but I think he wants to do it by peaceful means, not by military means, which is not a very welcome prospect in any case. But at least if we have a world that's still intact, it still gives us the opportunity to get things right, to reverse the direction we're going.
Absolutely. I think the stakes are very, very high. I think we're in a very, very dangerous situation. I'm also recalling one of the first documents written about war with China by Gompert was called Thinking Through the Unthinkable, which is a direct reference, a dog whistle to Herman Kahn's thinking about the unthinkable, which is really about, ending the world or, risking the end of the world in order to defeat the Soviet Union. But Regis, you have also researched, reported, and presented a lot about nuclear war and the risks involved. Currently, it looks like not only is the US escalating in all domains towards strategic confrontation, but it seems like there is a very strong likelihood that the United States is planning of using preemptive nuclear strikes against its enemies, not the least of which it sees China as its greatest pacing threat. What are your thoughts?
Well, I made a film in 2016, and it's the reason I came to Russia for the first time. The film was about the imminent, real danger of nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And to finish that film, I felt I had to go to Russia to find out for myself what the Russian people were like, what the Russian government was really like. And I returned home and I finished that film. And at the time, the Bureau of Atomic Scientists and their doomsday clock was at like 3.5 minutes to midnight. And I titled that film 30 Seconds to Midnight. I felt we were that close. And I felt even if somebody was not a Dr. Strangelove that was ready to push the nuclear button, because of what the United States and NATO were doing in this part of the world, the danger of an accident was very, very real. And if I were to publish that film today, I would entitle it The Final Countdown. And I would start at about 5 seconds to midnight. Now, I would like to add this. I think all of humanity owes a tremendous debt and respect to the patience that President Vladimir Putin has exercised over the progression of provocations, the crossing of red lines, even striking deep now into Russia and where I live in Crimea. President Putin has shown such tremendous patience not to cross the nuclear Rubicon. I really believe that. I think he has taken one blow after the other. In terms of the United States and the Pentagon and these neocons that have been running that government, they interpret President Putin's patience as a weakness. And I have to tell you, living here now for 5 years, President Putin is not a weak person. The Russian people believe in him. His popularity is in the 80th percentile. And the Russian people, when I talk to them, do you think there's a possibility of nuclear war? They say no, because they don't think anybody can be crazy enough to do it. But at the end of my film, 30 Seconds to Midnight, I posed this question, that what we are involved in is an epic battle for the future order of the world. Whether it's American hegemony or it's the Russian, Chinese, BRICS vision of a future world, a multipolar world, will those people who are controlling the United States and the West, recognizing they have lost this epic battle for control of the future order of the world, take us all down in a nuclear Armageddon? That's where we are today, I think. Are these people crazy enough, recognizing they've lost the control of the future order of the world, do something crazy, do something totally insane, and I think satanic?
Well, I don't want to get religious here, but I have always said that, the ruling imperial elite who have hegemony, they would rather see the end of the world than the end of their hegemony. And so, I don't know if that, goes into a theological dimension, but certainly I think it's important for us to remember that as World War II was preparing or brewing, I think there were a lot of people who said this cannot happen because the harms and the damage would be so inconceivable that no sane, rational leader or country would actually initiate or, respond in such a way as to create world war. And we know that, that was not the case. We know that World War II happened when it was thought to be, by many historians and scholars, impossible to happen. And I feel like we're on the same cusp right now, that, there's a part of us that just cannot believe that this is happening, although all the signs show that we are moving closer and closer to global war, and that it seems that nuclear use seems already to be normalized and prepared. Peter, your last thoughts.
You could say the same thing about World War I, KJ. The people thought we were too advanced. Civilization had progressed too far for us ever to revert to world war and that kind of barbarism. People were horrified by World War I. And in that war, we introduced poison gas. The next war we introduced, so that war was considered the chemist's war. The next war was the physicist's war. World War III, I don't know whose war that's going to be. Artificial intelligence war. As when Oliver was interviewing Putin some years ago, Oliver Stone, he asked Putin if he had ever seen the movie Dr. Strangelove. And Putin said he hadn't. So Oliver showed it to him on his computer. They watched it together. Oliver was just there with Regis and Ray McGovern and others in Moscow. And I emailed Oliver and I said, with all the discussion of using artificial intelligence within the command and control structure on nuclear weapons and taking the human element out of it, he really needs to show Putin this time failsafe. Because failsafe, which came out the same year as Dr. Strangelove, and in many ways is equally powerful, is based upon not a human, not General Jack the Ripper going crazy and launching an attack, but a technological failure launching an attack. So which is maybe even more plausible in this world now. So, I agree with both of you that we're at a crucial juncture and the world is changing and U.S. hegemony is faltering and the U.S. is resisting the pressure to develop a serious multipolar world, a shared world, a different kind of world that is not dominated by the United States. And there is in that situation a real danger of people who are so resistant to change being willing to risk taking the world down with them. As Regis was suggesting before, and you too, KJ, when Biden, every time Zelensky asked for a new weapon system, Biden hesitated He said, no, it's too provocative. We don't want to start World War III. 2 months later, he said yes and gave in. And how did the American policymakers interpret that under Biden? That we could ignore Russia's red lines with impunity because they clearly are going to back down and not act on their threats and do what Putin had actually threatened, which is to use every weapon system available rather than to allow this kind of attack on Russia. But it's that kind of mentality that we can do anything. We can push them, we can provoke them, and we know they're ultimately gonna not going to be willing to take that step. Well, I don't trust deterrence theory because deterrence theory works up to the point where it doesn't work anymore. And as Kennedy said, when the generals wanted him to attack the Cuban missile sites and invade Cuba, he said, if we listen to what they say, they've got one big advantage over us, that none of us will be here alive to tell them they were wrong afterwards. Khrushchev made the same point over and over again. Unfortunately, I don't see a Khrushchev and a Kennedy out there right now. And so I do see more, in some ways, limited human beings making these decisions. I hope Putin and Xi's better angels do prevail and that they're able to drag the rest of these guys along with them. But I look at this coalition of the willing who don't want Zelensky to end this war, want this to keep going. And I look at the kind of hawks that I see around the planet right now, and it doesn't make me optimistic. Doesn't make me give up because we can't afford to give up, but we have to be sober and realizing what kinds of people we're dealing with and how dangerous the situation is.
I absolutely agree with you, Peter. I also want to point out, as Regis has pointed out as well, that there are many times during the Cold War when the world almost crested over into nuclear war, except for some very cool-headed Russian officers who thought through and didn't press or retaliate.
And catch some Americans too. In
Yes.
1983, during Able Archer,
Yes.
Perutz was, he understood that if he had done certain things, the Soviets would have interpreted it as a real nuclear attack. And so Americans have backed off also.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I also want to point out that current U.S. nuclear force posture is a counterforce. That is to say, NUTS, nuclear utilization target selection, which is another way. It's a fancy way of saying first strike. The U.S. believes it can get off a nuclear sucker punch.
The U.S. nuclear doctrine has been first strike throughout the nuclear age. This is not anything new. It's so dangerous.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned artificial intelligence, which people have compared to nuclear weapons. Certainly, it will facilitate nuclear weapons. Certainly, the origins of artificial intelligence actually have to do with creating automated battle management to continue fighting after all human sentient life has been extinguished. And if you look at people like Palmer Luckey and Alex Karp of Palantir, you can see that not only do they believe in a kind of digital Wolfowitz doctrine, that the US is going to have this digital AI dominance over the rest of the world in order to bend the world to its will, but they are also extreme China hawks, and they seem very, very willing to start a war with China. But I'm going to toss it back to you, Regis. What are your final thoughts about the situation that we're in, the things that we need to be doing, the things that people need to understand?
Well, my final thought, and I would like to give a shout out to Peter and all of his book, The Untold History of the United States. That changed my view of the United States and the world on a very basic fundamental level. So that said, my final thoughts are, as you mentioned, KJ, or Peter, I'm not terribly optimistic. I don't see a lot of hope and goodwill coming from the adults who are in the room in the United States and in Brussels, across the EU. That's very frightening. But living now in Russia, amongst these incredible people who have suffered so much over so many centuries because of the attacks of the West, like them, I feel secure. They're not living in fear and chaos here. They're living life as they always have. We've gone to events this week where tens of thousands of people are out into the streets. I live in Crimea. We go about life in spite of being attacked by drones almost on a daily basis without fear. There's a lack of chaos here. There's a sense of unity. There's a sense of Russian identity, which I have never seen anywhere else in the world, much less in my country. And so I would like for people who are watching this show and listening to us to try to understand the Russian people and the Russian sense of almost being invincible. They're not living in fear with everything that's going on. You don't hear them talking about that. Oh, a few people are concerned about political and geopolitical things. The vast majority of people are convinced that life here is good, life is worth living, and life is worth protecting.
Absolutely, yes. And I will just kind of add, reading from the joint statement, the two sides, referring to Russia and China, are convinced that the destinies of the peoples of all countries are interrelated. States and their associations should not seek to ensure their own security at the expense and to the detriment of the security of other states. The two sides, Russia and China, call upon all states to adhere to the principle of equal and indivisible security, make maximum efforts to eliminate conflicts in relations between states, and build comprehensive, integrated, and sustainable security throughout the world on a collective basis, and to resolve contradictions via dialogue and mutually respectful consultations, reject Cold War mentality and zero-sum games. I think those are good words for us to hold on to as we acknowledge the continuing leadership of the Global South and trust or hope that it can lead us out of this terribly dangerous situation. Thank you. And to finish off, for a change of pace, the following is a choreographed dance fight sequence from the 2022 Spring Festival Gala performance in China. It demonstrates two martial arts, the internal art of Bagua and the southern style of Wing Chun.